On behalf of the Computer History Museum, I'd like to welcome each of you here. Some of you are returning friends, and for many of you, it's the first time at the museum. I'm Marguerite Gong Hancock. I'm the Vice President of Innovation and Programming, and together with Kate McGregor, who's our Director of Education, we want to welcome you. We serve as co-leads of Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access at the museum, in addition to the other areas that we lead in the museum. So there's been great anticipation for this gathering because the museum is on a journey, perhaps like many of you in your organizations. We have been thinking deeply about where we are and where we'd like to go. And as we think about partners, sources of information, expertise, collaborators for helping us move forward, we thought that what better way than to bring together professionals for whom we share a similar passion as well as professional expertise to share ideas. So that was the genesis of this idea. We're so grateful to the Kapor Center for their support of our programming, work that we're doing in diversity inclusion this year that spans collections, exhibits that we'll be doing this year, digital exhibits, as well as programming in this event. As I mentioned, we not only have people here that are gathered, we'll be recording it, we'll also be sharing it out and making a report to share with others who couldn't join us in the Bay Area as well as beyond. A little bit about CHM. The museum has a 4-decade history. We've been here in this building last, almost 20 years. We have 100,000 artifacts in our collection, over 1,000 oral histories, first-person voices of some of the tech innovators, entrepreneurs, and change makers who are telling their story, and of course, a wide array of source materials. We own 2 other buildings that have both our storage as well as research center and archives, and this is our public-facing building where we have 30,000 square feet of exhibits, to an auditorium with that we seat 400 for regular programming that happens several times a month. We have a learning lab here, an education program, and other materials. So welcome. And we have many who are here from our team to welcome you as well. Just a note about where we are in our journey. We're all emerging out of the pandemic, and I don't know how it's been for you, but it's been a time of great challenge for cultural institutions, finding ways to sustain ourselves financially, to continue to engage and impact our audiences. One of the things that we've been doing is doubling down on our investment in technology, thinking about how can technology enable us to advance our mission. So I'll just mention this because some people have asked about that. It means not only changing some of our internal systems with databases and things, but actually using technology to power the ways that we're using and sharing, making accessible our collection. So deep work in collections asset management, digital asset management, storytelling, and really exciting things that are part of this big vision that we have about Open CHM, how we can use technology, everything from cloud-based services to machine learning and AI to make our collection more accessible and meaningful for people. So today, as you look around the room, we're really pleased to have representatives from more than a dozen museums. And I'm just going to ask you to raise your hand. We'll have chances to meet each other a little bit later. But if you want to just raise your hand when I call out your institution. Those who are here from the Asian Art Museum, great. Children's Discovery Museum of San Jose, welcome. Computer History Museum, wonderful. Curiosity, maybe joining us a little bit later. Exploratorium, great to have you here. Fine Arts Museum, San Francisco, welcome. History San Jose, glad that you're here. I.D.E.A, San Jose, welcome. Lawrence Hall of Science, glad that you're here. Los Altos History Museum, welcome. Oakland Museum of California, great. San Jose Museum of Art, that's right, wonderful. SFMOMA, wonderful. Contemporary Jewish Museum, great. And the Tech Interactive. So what a group of people, diverse perspectives in different areas of functionality and representing an incredible wealth that we have here in the Bay Area. So we'll have multiple parts of the day. We're going to kick off with a panel sharing some of their experiences and expertise. Then we'll move into our breakout sessions on content, audience, and metrics. We'll come back for sharing, a sharing session, and then a chance for lunch. Don't miss the opportunity for some special behind-the-scenes tours led by our Senior Curator, Mark Weber, and also our Vice President for Collections Exhibition, Kirsten Tasha. So that's the plan for the day. With that, I'd like to invite up our panelists. So Julia, Talents, and Davida, please join me up here in the front. So let me tell you a little bit about the three people that we have the pleasure to hear from. First, Julia. She's the Director of Inclusion and Belonging at the Asian Art Museum. Previously, she led social impact and DEI at Thumbtack, so she has a background in tech she's bringing to the museum world. As an entrepreneur, she co-founded and served as Director of People and Culture for a company in the restaurant industry, and also founded and served as an Executive Director at a nonprofit entrepreneurship incubator. So join me in welcoming Julia. Next, Talents is Oakland Museum of California's new Senior Director of People, bringing more than 25 years of experience. Most recently, he served as the Director of Training and Business Operations at the Tech Interactive, formerly the Tech Museum of Innovation. He also served as co-leader of the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, Access, I.D.E.A. Committee at the Tech. Welcome. So glad you're here. And next, Davida. Davida Lindsay Bell is the Chief People Inclusion Officer at SFMOMA, building the museum's cultural transformation efforts, including diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and employee experience over the last 2 years. She has over 2 decades of people and cultural experience working in e-commerce, healthcare, technology, logistics, manufacturing, consumer products, retail, as well as the cultural arts sector. So glad you're here, Davida.
Thank you.
So I thought it'd be really interesting just to start with a question about your journey. And Davida, I'd like to start with you and ask, can you tell us about your personal journey that's led to your passion for this work in diversity inclusion, and then also a little bit about your organization's journey?
Absolutely. So I am a Black female, cisgendered, go by she, her. I am a working professional and a single mom, divorcee, of a 14-year-old child. And my partner is a white male of 9 years. So that alone, right, has many intersections and allows me to bring a very unique, dynamic perspective to the work that I do at the museum. As far as SFMOMA goes, I started at one of the most incredible times anyone can start a new gig as a head of people, right before anyone knew COVID or the pandemic here in the United States. I was there for about 60 days, and then we had to close the museum in March. So it's been quite the ride. So in addition to the pandemic, dealing with COVID-19, putting together safety protocols, deploying digital transformation over the summer, we also had a host of issues, social issues that surfaced in the summer at the museum, in addition to what was happening in the world. And so we've been on a journey of deep introspection for the last couple of years since joining.
Thank you. How about you, Talents?
So,
tell us about your journey.
Once again, my name's Talents. I've been doing HR, which has shifted and pivoted. When I first started, it was called personnel. So for people in this room, I probably revealed your age or mine. But it's shifted and it's changed in terms of its perspective, in terms of how we deal with staff and people. My pronouns are he, him. I have 3 children. My wife is Latinx, so that gives me a different perspective in terms of the view of people in my world and also people at work. where the Oakland Museum is, I joined them about 6 months ago. So after the pandemic, different part of our journey, but definitely a unique time as we were building back, as we were getting our museum back open, inviting more staff to join us, and it's been a whirlwind. It's been challenging. It's definitely been, but it's a challenge that many of us should embrace. And I think it just causes you to think differently. It causes you to think proactively in terms of how you recruit, the things you do for your existing staff and new staff. And we're still on this journey. I think that's the one thing about the journey is you can't just put a pitch or a tent or a flag in the ground and say you've arrived, because things keep pivoting and changing. So just embracing that change and keep pivoting.
Thank you. Julia.
I've really loved everything that I've heard so far. It's definitely been a journey. My name is Julia, and I was born in Shanghai during the one-child policy, so this work is deeply meaningful to me. Came to the States at 6, and that's around the time I met my family as well. China's one-child policy has really caused some social issues, and it has a wave of effects. So that's what brings me a lot of meaning to this work, is making sure that we have a place where everyone belongs and feels like they have a home in the institution. And I would say, my pronouns are she and her. Here's a fun fact. I actually got married in an art museum, the St. Louis Art Museum. And my husband his family are refugees from Albania. So also a lot of intersectionality, what it means to be a new American. Also what it means to be American. American can mean so many different things. We are all part of this fabric. And especially in this moment right now, it's why I took this role at the Asian Art Museum, as I really believe in the power of storytelling. And I know, at least in my upbringing, there's many times that my fellow Asian Americans felt a sense of disappearance or being invisible. So, it's so powerful to hear these stories and so powerful to be seen. And at the Asian Art Museum, I think emerging out of COVID-19, it's a similar journey as described by my peers, that it's a journey. It's a journey, but this is a moment. And in this challenge, I feel like there's an opportunity. There's moments that we haven't been seen that in the future we can, and we can rewrite this narrative. I'm excited for what's next, and I'm looking out here and I'm seeing everyone that's here today, and I'm deeply moved by so many museum professionals that want to engage in this conversation. So thank you for inviting us.
Thank you. I feel the same way about this sense of purpose and power that's in the room and of the work that we're doing. I'd like to turn now to audience and think about the ways that we engage, serve, give voice to our members of our community. And Julia, let's start with you. Can you give us an example of some of the strategies that you've tried to include to give access to more diverse audiences? What's working, what hasn't worked? Any lessons to be learned?
Yes, many lessons. Just for context, I've been at the Asian Art Museum since late February, so I'm very new to this role. But what I can say about just my experience in DEAI and social impact and various teams is what works is making sure that you're empowering the voices that you're empowering the voices that you want to empower, as in leadership or folks should not speak on behalf of the underrepresented or marginalized groups, that they should have that voice and they should not feel pressured to say anything that they are not ready to say or don't want to say. And also that it's a collaboration. We're in an institution. So I I've seen this happen at my previous organizations as well as when there's perhaps like grassroots efforts or et cetera, but it can only go so far without support and support resources, funding perhaps from leadership. So I do think what works is a partnership. It's working together on programs that make sense, making sure we're tracking them, we're holding each other accountable, and treating it, in tech, it was OKRs, for example, to track it quarter to quarter, as important as other perhaps revenue driving agendas. So, those are some learnings of when you're strategizing, when you're creating your H1, H2 planning, to make sure that DEI is part of the conversation and you're thinking ahead and having the resources and having leadership in the room to support that, as well as amplifying the voices of underrepresented groups and et cetera, to make sure that what we're working on is in alignment with the people that we want to serve.
To add,
Please
I
add.
loved everything you said. In my experience, again, being at SFMOMA for 2 years, we had to really grapple, the collective we, from the board down to senior staff, had to grapple with the fact that our staff really had no voice. And when it comes to programming, the museum has had a heavy focus naturally on the art and neglected, for a high degree, the people that have the experiences to bring some of these dynamic audience moments to life. So I love everything that you said, but we had to find our voices, even as executives, to come to the realization that we had it backwards. And so it's a matter of really allowing the people at the bottom to lead. And so how do they express and live through their own agency? Because it's been stifled. And so I think it's important to bring the collective voices to the table. Loved everything you said.
Love that. Thank you.
I would also concur. Oftentimes, many of our decisions, the things that we do are board-driven, they're leadership-driven. But we always have to, the Oakland Museum has to ask ourselves, and we do ask ourselves, let's make sure that we're getting the voices of our staff at the lowest rung and make sure that, their concerns, their needs, what they like to see are being met, and that we're always asking ourselves that, and through every single decision, being transparent. I think transparency is one of those things, depending on where you are in an organization, you may not know what happens in the back room.
That's right.
But staff are curious, volunteers are curious, many people middle management may be curious. So I think making sure that you're involving your staff, your volunteers, yes, having your board involved is key, yes. Having them believe in the vision of what you're doing and how you're empowering and bringing those voices to the table. And just always staying true to that. Never, regardless of where your funding initiatives are, regardless of where your revenue initiatives are, to always make sure that you're bringing that to bear, you're bringing those voices to the table, and you don't forget it. Because I think a lot of times things get lost in wherever your mission is going, whether it's a new capital campaign or whether it's, we've got a new revenue membership initiative. Please employ yourselves to always make sure that those voices are being heard.
Thank you. We've talked so far with a large kind of focus on what's happening internally. It's so important that we feel that sense within our organizations. As we think as cultural institutions about our potential role for driving social change, I'd like to now think about our audiences in that perspective. Talents, maybe I could start with you in thinking about an example of an I.D.E.A project or initiative that was particularly focused on driving social change or social impact. And can you give us an example? What were some of the goals and outcomes, and how you might apply what you learned from that to what's going forward?
I think about before I came. A decision was made at my institution to be an anti-racist institution. And that statement alone and the time that it was made, it was a very powerful statement. But that meant a lot. It meant to the staff, to the board, that there was a lot of work to be done. And that there's a lot that you don't know. And I think that's a hard realization for many of us. There's a lot that we don't know. And in that, you have to be continually curious. and keep asking questions. And when you're asking from a curious nature, when you're always trying to find, you're never in the wrong place. So we're continuing on this journey. It wasn't that long ago that we made that statement, and we've done staff initiatives, we've done board initiatives where we're looking at every single thing within the institution, and structures of white patriarchy and many of those things, we're evaluating them, looking at them, and making sure that staff know that that's a concern for us. And then two, one of the things we're trying to do for our staff is make sure that we provide initiatives and training and opportunities for them to grow and learn, and regardless of where they are in the institution, whether they're on the lowest rung, middle rung, that they have opportunities to acquire skills and learn and grow within the institution. Or sometimes I always tell myself, sometimes when we teach new skills, that causes our staff to, okay, I'm going to start looking outside the institution. But is that necessarily a bad thing in our industry? And many times they might go to your institution, or they might come to mine. But that's okay, because that should be empowering our staff, empowering our future leaders. Should be something that is at the forefront and crux of what we do.
Thank you. I'd like to turn now to thinking about our content and whether it's in our programming, our digital content, education programs, tours, whatever it is such an important way that we affect change and engage with our audiences. And one of the key questions is about decision making. So, Davida, I'd like to start with you and ask, in your institution, who are the decision makers for building I.D.E.A in your content and applying new lenses to consider it? What's the process and criteria? Could you just help open that window a little bit, and how that might help us inform, kind of better decisions as we're thinking about how those decisions are made in our own museums?
Absolutely. So as part of our, again, our journey of introspection, so in addition to being at a place of intentionally building out our diversity inclusion plan, we also realized, again, by way of COVID, having financial challenges, that we needed to do a refresh of our strategic plan. That then allowed us to go back to our 2018 strategic plan to look at the entire framework of that and really come to terms that we really had no decision-making framework, right? So these decisions can get lost, some are deferred why? Where are we making those choices to invest? So we introduced a decision-making framework, and again, a lot of socialization. So we're using something called RAPID. For those of you who may or may not be familiar, so R is who recommends. A is who's going to approve, right? So who are the approvers in the room? Who are the performers? Who do you need to seek input from? And who's the ultimate decider? In part of coming up with that RAPID framework, we knew, again, just in me, needing to galvanize and bring our staff along. Again, I'm big grassroots, let's lead from the bottom. They had to come along, and so we did a lot of workshopping to actually embed this thought process in our culture. It's not perfect. We have to do RAPID 2.0, which is a lot of, let's do some breakout rooms, some conversations for people to really understand, because we're still tangled up a bit in the decision making. I think a lot of us are challenged with that. And so one way that we put RAPID into action is through I have to bring my notes, our exhibition matrix 2.0. So again, how are we allocating resources, right? How do we figure out who gets the best investment? Where do we tell our philanthropy to go fundraise? But how do we take our DEI statement of intention, again, being very intentional about our commitments, and put it through the entire exhibition planning process? So we are prioritizing what's called the Arts for All segment. So we are doing a lot of work just in evaluating what our visitors are thinking. So Arts for All really caters to the most marginalized, underappreciated communities. And for people who really need more access in understanding wall text, again, it's not just for the arts-oriented, those who are arts-educated. And then we go down to, again, who's part of the overall process. So where we, again, pluck apart the input and where we get dialogue from, we go to the staff again. But that's where, to Talence's point, we have to be representative of our community. And so how are we staffing? So there's a lot that goes behind, what we're doing, because you can't just have a homogenized group making decisions about Pasirabad. So it's very critical that we have those voices at the table. And then transparency and visibility into the process. So again, once we have these conversations to explore how we're going to research and how we're going to invest funds, we share that openly with our staff. Through our all-staff meetings, through our various channels, through email. We are not a Slack house. I miss Slack terribly. We are Microsoft, so through Microsoft Teams activations and channels. And so that's a little bit on how we come to terms and grapple with decisions on content. And because we have so many things happening right now, we have rapid response teams to pluck apart things such as that of what happened at the TOPS market. I mean, everything. We bring diverse perspectives to the table to help make decisions on what content we share sometimes publicly through our social platforms.
Thank you so much. Talents or Julie, would you like to add anything on that dimension about decision making, or also on the content side? What kinds of ways are your museums building I.D.E.A. into your content? Either one. Comments from?
I think I'll start off. I'm a storyteller too. I like that you mentioned that. And I think back to a conference I went to, and during the keynote, the speaker had said, they were trying to find like the top scientists, to be able to present, to do this panel. And what they thought was, okay, what is the first, neuroscientists that we call will bring? But what they found were they were white males. So of course, that's not the DE&I that you want. So as they thought about that, they said, look, we have to cast a wider net. We have to find ways to bring BIPOC. We have to find ways to bring women to the table. And when you cast a wider net, you are doing yourself a service to make sure that when it comes to decision making, it's not kind of this, it's everybody's in agreement, and it's kind of all the same, similar thought box. But some of the times the best decisions are made when you're bringing diverse voices, diverse faces to the table. And not just from your employee base. That's key, obviously. Let me preface that, because you had mentioned that. That's key, that you're doing the work to bring a diverse workforce, and not just, of course, from the bottom rung, but also from the middle and the top. It takes work.
Yes.
Because if we just reached out to, I'm going to post my job, I'm going to post my thing on, one location, one spot, you will get good candidates. However, they might not be the diverse candidates that you want. So, I'm a storyteller, I told you. So I'll get back to the question, but that's kind of key for me, is when it comes to making sure that you have the right decision makers. It starts from that conversation of recruiting, is making sure that if I'm recruiting top executives, middle managers, all staff, that you're doing that job to make sure that you're getting diverse voices and faces at the table, because they will be your decision makers of today and tomorrow. So that's key. Obviously, your board, making sure your board's diverse. Over the years, this has changed for many of us as we've looked at our board. And, we probably need to do a better job of who we recruit and bring to the table, because that affects your decision making, right? That affects what content you bring in. So making sure that when you look at how your board is made up and the requirements and all of that you're really evaluating, your executive team is really evaluating, how you bring those voices to bear. And then now when you get to content, if you have an executive team that's diverse, if you have a board that is diverse, and you have a staff that is diverse, guess what? It organically happens that they're going to say, we need to bring content, an exhibition, a permanent or traveling or temporary exhibition that brings the voices of the community to bear, so that when Latinx kids, BIPOC kids, women come to your museum, they see themselves.
That's right.
They see themselves represented. They get inspired. I mean, I always try to remind myself that we're in the inspiration business. Whether it's through art, culture, literature, science, we're in the inspiration business. And how do these future leaders, when the field trip kids start to come, and when grandmas and grandpas bring their grandchildren here, we're in the inspiration business. So how do we display content that inspires them? where they see themselves either being displayed or talked about, or I see myself in that painter. I see myself in that engineer. I see myself in that artist. So I'm going to put a pin in myself because I know you probably got some good stuff to talk about. But it starts there, recruiting an executive team, board, staff, so that now all throughout your institution, the decisions are already being, and the voices are already being elevated.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Talents. Julia.
I love that. So I think what I really resonate with what you were saying just now is about our museums as a place for inspiration and being for different communities and having different communities see themselves within us. And I think for us, what's going to be really powerful, and again, just preface that we haven't launched this quite yet at the Asian Art Museum, but we will be launching affinity groups, which are employee resource groups. And in affinity groups, it's all about amplifying voices, making sure that we're connected, having learning and development opportunities with individuals that you may not have otherwise have met. And given that we, as museums are a public forum and a public space, very excited to welcome other affinity groups and employee resource groups to be a part of the conversation, to see themselves in our space. And, in my previous organizations, we always, really encouraged our affinity groups to be the ones with the idea, bring the ideas, perhaps write about that and be community leaders. So again, we're early in that journey at the Asian Art Museum, but that's where I do feel we are going to really elevate and unblock our various underrepresented folks at our museum and making sure that we're right in the middle of a strategic plan ourselves and making sure that before we get ahead of ourselves, applying principles that make voices heard and flatten out the way that decisions are made. And honestly, it can be a complex and challenging journey, but it's absolutely necessary if museums are going to stay relevant and innovate and bring in the audiences that we want for the future.
Thank you. One of the conversations I was having earlier, we were saying, I think Courtney said, I think it's so important that we recognize where we want to go and what the gaps are, but sometimes intention leads to lack of action. There's not enough action, and I added on, action leads to unintended consequences. So I'd like to next talk about metrics. And metrics are so powerful in helping guide us, give us accountability, help us diagnose what's working and what's not. I've been admiring SFMOMA's metrics, and you had raised your hand when I talked with you earlier about who would be willing to kind of kick off this portion. So Davida, tell us about metrics. What types of metrics related to I.D.E.A are you using and why? And any advice as we think about metrics that are really meaningful?
Good question. And to Talence's point, again, it starts internally. And so I know we keep going back there, but it truly does. And so again, back to when we were on our journey in building out our DEI plan and really, again, it being grassroots, we intentionally put in a subsection specifically to continuity and accountability for how, we, the collective we, the museum board and staff will hold each other accountable for upholding the principles and values of DEI, which our museum, our core values are inclusive, passionate, empathic, and brave, DEI in itself. And so it was very critical for us to identify a way to move from what we had developed, which was a static dashboard, had no meaning. I liken it to sometimes organizations that come up with these mission, vision, value statements, and it's nothing but a poster in a drawer, but has no life or emotion to it. And so we knew that we needed to move away from the static and have something that's far more interactive, hence what you see on our website through Power BI. It was very important also for us to demonstrate, back to your question on social awareness, elevation, change, for us to demonstrate that we truly are committed to holding ourselves accountable. Who wants to go back to what we experienced as a museum in 2020? And so there you'll see things published like artist identity. We brought in a host of consultants, and so our journey started in 2019, I say pre-I.D.E.A, where we brought in a group by the name of Race Forward to do some work between board and staff. And then in 2020, took us some time, but it was really how do we see each other for who we are and treat each other more beautifully. And so went on, and how do we break through the barriers between staff versus board, right? And how do we elevate levels of understanding of both sets of population to each other? So we brought in Dr. Darlene Hall, who started to break apart things such as power and privilege, power dynamics, privilege. It was very, very critical for us to educate our staff, one, for them to feel heard, for them to feel respected. But that didn't stop there, so we brought in someone else, Leverage to Lead, who helped us with our statement of intention. And that's where I think a lot of the work started for the museum, is to have deep-rooted conversations to excavate the values, because they have a dark side to them. Dark side, one is, again, we're perfectionists, and I think it's part of the nature of the work that we do. And so how do we break away from some of those norms? Our dashboard, our metrics are not perfect. We don't have a representative community such as that of the San Francisco Bay Area. Let's put it out there so we can hold ourselves accountable, ideate, continue to experiment, and challenge ourselves to be better. So you have staff on there, we have artists, we have our board, and it'll continue to grow. And it was a very rewarding experience, and to get us to a place of broadening identity, intersectionality, and really have, again, a cross-representation. We brought in Dr. San Chang, who's a licensed psychotherapist who focuses on trauma, honestly, and identity. And so she came in and did a lot of education for us as a museum in order for us to have those multi-factor identifications, which, by the way, will be part of our application process through Lever, because we're very serious about shaping and changing the culture of what we look like at SFMOMA.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. If any of you haven't had a chance yet to look at the dashboards, which are publicly available, they're very open, transparent, and as you said, you're not done.
We're not done.
So things like art in the collection.
It's a journey.
Artists on art that's on
display.
I mean, this is
in our collection.
In the collection, these are things that take a tremendous amount of investment to get the data in the first place, and courage, as you say, to be brave to share it. So thank you. Julia, I just want to turn to you next. You're coming from a tech background where you worked with a lot of metrics, OKRs, and success metrics and other things. As you bring that, you had mentioned that gives you kind of a different lens to bring now to the of metrics for the museum world. Do you want to say more about that, please?
Sure. So what I've seen happen in the past, especially with fast-moving organizations, not saying museums are necessarily fast-moving, but if you don't write it out and measure it, sometimes it can get lost into the ether. And we want to move towards a practice where we capture and be very real with our metrics. I think part of the first step is taking a hard look at ourselves and just the what so. So part of my journey in this new role is just being honest about, hey, like this is where we're at, and it may be very far off from where we want to be, but that's the starting point. And the way that I think about my work in terms of the museum is people, museum, and our greater community. So what are the things that we can track for our people programs? What are the metrics that we can track for our museum itself? And then for the greater community, because we do so much community work. And I love what Davida said about really orienting to what is our purpose. And that our I.D.E.A purpose and vision it is different from the museum overarching. And what are the gaps and what can we measure there as well? So again, like coming from tech, we were very rigorous with these measurements. I'm not saying that we need to be quite as intense, given we don't have necessarily, we have boards and not shareholders. However, we want to make sure that there, they're visible, and it's just a language. It's not, punishing or making someone wrong or anything. It's just being able to say, hey, this is where we are at this certain point of time, and how are we doing, and understanding like what can we do better. I like to say love is or could be betters, and continue to iterate.
Thank you. Talents, please add your perspective.
I like what Julia said there, continue to iterate, because things are constantly changing. I mean, even if you evaluate your metrics, I.D.E.A had went into detail about how we're trying to evaluate our staff metrics, how we're doing on our goals, and that it's not in a drawer, or it's something on a website that people see. Oh, that's an awesome, vision statement, mission statement. But it's how do you measure against that? How do you continue? And I think one of the most powerful things that we can say is, that we haven't arrived. That we're not there yet. But that being okay, because otherwise you find yourself always striving for perfectionism, because you're always trying to get to that 100%. You're always trying to get to that. And I'll be honest, that 100% is many times draining, unobtainable, drives people to depression and other things that we see. So it's as you take your measurements and you're looking at how are we doing as far as recruiting and how are we doing on our audience and bringing different voices and people to the table, you've got to be able to, okay, this is a snapshot in time. This is where we are. Let's continue to iterate and make changes where we can. And always be curious. I'll keep coming back to that. Asking the questions. I kind of like I tell my kids, there's never a wrong question. A lot of times, well, we shouldn't be asking that. Well, why not? And so I implore you, continue to ask your board, your staff, your teams, your leadership teams, keep asking questions, because that's how we iterate. That's how we evolve. And a lot of times when people are suppressing questions, there's problems, underlying problems there. So always be curious, be intentional. And one of my favorite things is I'm humble. So I even so as I'm hearing the questions, there's never a wrong question with me, so that's a good question. Thank you for asking that. Even if I don't have the answer, because I know many times we'll get asked questions where we don't have the answer, but that's okay.
That's okay.
Because we don't have to be perfect.
Great.
And we're still evolving, we're still finding, we're still trying to make changes and iterations, and that's okay.
Thank you. Well, speaking of questions, we're going to get everybody a chance now to have a chance to voice your questions. And as you're thinking about that, I just want to ask kind of a lightning round question, just a minute each, since we're combining both strategy and action. In 1 minute, what is a top priority that you have for the year ahead for diversity and inclusion?
Only one?
1 minute and one example, just to give us a little bit of inspiration, a sense of what you're doing. So thank you, Davida.
Thank you. I think it's just trying to sustain the work. So we unveiled, I'll say, our DEI plan in March of this year. And so, what you don't see is that it's about 25 pages. And so you see the pretty stuff, but there's a lot of detail there over the next 5 years. So it's truly making sure that all the functional areas, are firing on all cylinders, so we can continue to hold ourselves accountable. I think the other piece is ensuring that the systems are in place to ensure that that's happening. And so I love your reference to OKRs. And so we also use a product called Culture Amp. And so Culture Amp is where we do a lot of our employee listening strategy components, but it's also where we house our goals, performance, our one-on-one conversations, just again, ensure that the rigor and that is there and that we're being intentional about sustaining the efforts. And last thing, if I have 20 seconds left, is we are also in the home stretch of completing our board-focused DEI plan for the next 5 years. And so we have our board meeting next week. Well, that'll be shared, and we've identified the top 2 goals for the board to start diving into.
Fantastic.
So sustainability of the work.
Big agenda. You've set where you want to head for the next 5 years and executing. Thank you so much. Talents?
I'm glad she says, I won't try to take up too much time, but she said sustainability. And one of my favorite phrases is don't get weary doing good. Yep. So as you're doing this work, this good work, don't get, try to find space and grace for yourself, but don't get weary doing good. I think the one thing, because you said one thing, is equipping. So equipping your board, your managers, your staff with the tools, the training that's necessary to do this important diversity, equity, inclusion, and access work. Because sometimes, especially as we bring new managers, staff, wherever they're coming from, they may not have the right equipment or training. So, and that causes us to, to always continually do it, as opposed to, hey, we did that one time in 2021, so everybody was trained. Well, now you hired 20 new people. So what are you doing with that 20? So always equipping the board, the managers, the staff to do the work, because that's an important piece to me. And I think one of my hats that I wear is I'm a trainer. So I'm always invested in making sure that staff, managers, board are equipped, and that I don't presume or make the presumption that, let me look at your title. You should already have that. You should know that already, but not everybody knows. So, making sure that you're equipping people for the work that is now and is to come.
Great, thank you so much. Equipping for the work ahead. How about you, Julia?
I love those. I think for us at the Asian Art Museum, it's actually taking a step back and working on psychological safety and empathy. This has been a traumatic year. It's been a traumatic 3-4 years. Even in this week, it's been traumatic. And recognizing that we are all people, and staff, board, et cetera, we are having a deeper empathy for each other, and understanding that we don't want groupthink. We want people to feel safe to bring their questions, ideas, concerns to the table, and feel safe enough to vocalize that and understand that they won't be punished or et cetera. It's more just to have conversation without fear. That's the only way forward. So, I would love to say that, the focus is on the developing of our frameworks and et cetera, and that's like our main thing, but it's actually taking a step back, making sure that we ensure psychological safety and a culture of creativity and joy rather than fear.
Yes.
Thank you.
Love
Very
that.
wise to take that step back.
Love
we need
it.
to reflect, right?
Love
we need
it.
to create safety
Yep.
for each other. Who would like to kick off questions? If you could introduce yourself, your organization, and feel free to, if you would like to direct your question to a specific panel member. Russell, who's our programming producer and manager, has a microphone. Tim here in the front, would you like to start?
Thank you. This is for everyone. At the Asian Art Museum, we're trying to find ways for staff to feel comfortable asking difficult questions. We've created anonymous forms, and sometimes they'll get a little bit awkward because sometimes you can't ask follow-up questions and things like that. I'm wondering if anybody has a tool that does facilitate honest conversations, difficult conversations, in a healthy, collaborative, give and take way.
Maybe I'll dive in there, if okay.
Please, go ahead.
Yes, please.
Like Asian Art Museum, again, summer of 2020, I'm recovering from the summer of 2020 at SFMOMA. There were so many things that were not working well. And one of them was listening to staff and resolving the concerns that they brought to HR or they brought to managers. And so we wrote a new policy, a new practice, and we activated something similar called employee voice. So we have employee voice, plus we have, of course, the speaking up hotline. So we have those two channels where people can send in, but we also didn't want people to, we wanted people to be comfortable in unmasking themselves, right? Because we don't know who's behind the curtain and how do we hear you and listen and engage with you to understand what you're experiencing. So we have employee voice. And then, again, I mentioned Culture Amp. So Culture Amp is the tool that we use for our listening strategy just to get, perspective and feedback. And we, through Leverage to Lead was who we brought in. We did a lot of deep work. Again, our journey is never over. And I love what you said about psychological safety because that's coupled with our efforts to sustain the work, to get people to feel comfortable and show up as who they are. We did a lot of work in active listening, deep listening, just having healthy conversations. So we're moving toward that angle, and they were very significant in helping us. We also started DEI drop-in sessions, again with a random topic, for people to come and have that safe space to have, deep conversations, if they will. All those things have, I think, allowed people to speak up in our all-staff meetings, and it's no longer angry, it's no longer cathartic. People now feel as though they're being heard and they're being seen for who they are. Again, it's not perfect, we have a way to go, but we use multiple vehicles because it's very important for me to listen, respond, and act.
Thank you.
And I would say we're in the same boat in that we have multiple avenues for people to express themselves, whether they're an introvert, extrovert. Extroverts may be they'll speak up anytime,
Yes.
But introverts are not, they're not ready to do that in that format. So having, you had mentioned one of my favorite things, which is affinity groups, employee resource groups. That's an opportunity for people to talk and speak up in a safe manner. But also, too, having a system that takes data like Culture Amp or any type of survey software that gives you an anonymous way for employees to express themselves. Having those tools and resources really help people to kind of be their best selves, even when it's, because I think the issue you said is difficult conversations.
Yes.
And then lastly, what I want to prep us for is training management,
Yes.
To be able to receive the information in the right way, as opposed to the judgmental, that's my department that you're talking about right there. So it's taking that information in a way that is, just receiving it and letting it lay there for a bit, and then coming back. And sometimes I would tell you the most hardest part of a difficult conversation, especially when somebody's talking about, hey, the people department, the HR department isn't doing things fast enough. And it's, that's the Culture Amp thing that's coming to me. But taking that information, taking time to process, and telling, and responding in a way, hey, thank you for that question, that issue. Let's have a conversation at the appropriate time, but not forgetting to have the conversation.
There's a natural defensiveness, especially because of the need for those courageous conversations, and what does it mean for each of us. Talents, could you talk a little bit more about that training to be?
I was just going to say, this is just meant to be the beginning, and I see that other people have questions. I want to make sure that we give voice to others that have some questions. Please, Courtney.
So, hi, my name is Courtney Jones. I'm from the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco, and I'm actually asking this question from a facilitator point of view. I've been a facilitator in this work for years, and so I'm interested to know, just continuing that conversation, on how you all are able to. So in having those ways that white supremacy cultures are showing up in organizations and knowing the historical, ramifications of art institutions in general, what procedures or what techniques are you using in order to be able to evaluate? So training, I understand, and facilitating training, but there's harm that's being caused. Staff is already being harmed. So how are you holding management and or the individuals causing harm, holding them accountable for their actions? So I'm working on what a performance improvement plan would look like for specifically around diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I'd love to hear from you all to tell us how you are currently implementing things of that nature outside of just providing training and opening up those conversations for difficult conversations or having difficult conversations.
So great question. If everybody, just to help in case, especially for the recording, if you couldn't hear, question about holding accountability, for example, through performance evaluation for people, so that there's accountability for improvement planning. And I do see that there are quite a few other hands up, so I'm going to ask if just one of you, if there would want to speak up to that first. If there's any volunteer for that one. And
I'll go briefly,
Okay,
because I want to make space and
go
time
ahead.
for
Gonna
Davida. This is
ask
actually
for one, because
Just
I
one.
do
Okay.
see quite a few other hands up as well.
Davida, go ahead.
No.
So this is actually a core issue to human resource people managers. And so when a harm is done, a mistake, a problem, there's difficult conversations, and then there's the process for discipline documentation, performance improvement. And so I separate the two, because even though there is the need for a difficult conversation, in the harm, in the mistake, in the problem, it shouldn't dilute the fact that performance improvement or disciplinary action should happen. So that was my short answer because I didn't want to take up too much time. But
I could follow up with you. I have some add-ons.
That's great. And I hope you view this as just we're making connections and catalyzing conversations that can happen over lunch as well as over the breakout. Next.
I'm going to take my mask off. Thank you very much for bringing your wisdom to all of us today. So at the Contemporary Jewish Museum, where I'm from, in all of our conversations, what it really comes down to very often is pay equity. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit how you all are addressing that.
Who would like to start with that one?
Another journey. I said SFMOMA. And it's complex because we have, again, two various populations. We have union, non-union, so we're 50-50. So there's some nuances there that we have to grapple with. However, we wanted to, again, be very intentional and strategic in outlining certain components of our DEI strategic plan. So under our plan, we have a whole subsection for internal operations and goals specific to certain things, one such as that of pay equity, because it's across the board, whole house issue that we have to deal with. So we started this work, and good thing I have a beautiful relationship with my CFO, who leads with tremendous heart. And so together, we have partnered with a few various companies or components. Right now, we've landed with PayScale, and so we've been on this journey for about 12 months or so, walking through various stages of setting up a pay structure for our entire house. We brought in various data points, so Quad Associates, of course we have the AAM, AMD, and we farmed, our local communities. So it's something that we're addressing now. We're solving for it. It's not solved, and I don't know if it will ever be solved. Again, we are one of those areas that are financially constrained, and so how do we identify the problem, identify the gap, and then put together a strategy to perhaps phase, some of the inequities that were discovered.
Thank you. We'll take two last questions, one from James and then Rachel.
In terms of talking a little bit further about the case.
Do you want to introduce yourself too?
My name is James Leventhal. I work at the I.D.E.A. in San Jose. In terms of talking about case, and I don't remember exactly what the context was, but at some point, Julia, you mentioned the word income. Why aren't we talking more about income? Just in terms of thinking about building the case that if we truly build an inclusive culture, then we create a more robust and sustainable organization that's more relevant moving forward. Organizations like the Fine Arts Museums recently have made great efforts kind of spontaneously all of a sudden to bring Soul of a Nation. The Oakland Museum, and indeed also, I hope everybody goes. It's the most important museum in the whole world right now. But with the hip hop revolution and as being a fully integrated second of 3 or 4 exhibitions, it wasn't just a one-off thing in any way, shape, or form. My sense was it was utterly transformative. I think there were other organizational problems about how to identify that income and otherwise. But what about the income case? What about just saying that, especially to boards or otherwise, we make more meaningful, robust, relevant organizations, we do better. Black Panther is the most successful movie that was ever made, kind of thing. I don't want to overdo, and I don't know how you want to address it, but I'm just curious about that sort of the income case.
You started with Julia. Do you want to field that one?
Sure. And again, this is partly my opinion, so just wanted to preface that. But I think the conversation right now is what is relevant for the future and what is relevant for our future audiences. And we've been doing this big 5-year strategy, and it's part of it is around audiences. What does the younger population want to see, want to experience, experience-based? And I can't personally get out of my head, well, yes, there is an absolute business case for being an inclusive museum and celebrating different backgrounds and different cultures, as well as, and I think this is where intersectionality is going to be really interesting, not just in underrepresented groups, but also with tech and where we're going next in the art world. And I know it might be cheesy to say, but we have to start talking about NFTs. We have to start talking about how we can collaborate with our tech neighbors and what the future of museums might look like. Perhaps it takes us out of these four walls into VR. Who knows? But how I'm seeing this is, yes, there's a huge business case for what we don't know. And what we don't know might involve a younger generation that isn't here in this room right now. It might include our neighbors, perhaps just down the street with their ideas as well. But we have to keep innovating and keep thinking and thinking about the future.
Thank you. Just on a note about innovating digitally, CHM, this past year, one of the experiments that we've done in technology is creating a digital twin of the museum. So if you're interested in that, make sure you connect with one of the people here. We've been experimenting with a fully virtual museum, as well as digital games. Last question from Rachel.
I'm Rachel Wilner from the Tech Interactive in San Jose. I wanted to ask how you all have helped your organizations transition from an HR culture that's a little bit more based on enforcement and investigations than empathy and understanding. I've found that kind of culture can really suppress people's willingness to bring their concerns to the fore, but it can be challenging to get past the legal concerns on the HR side from time to time, and I'm curious how you all have dealt with that to encourage people to come forward with their concerns.
Just as we close, I'm going to ask, maybe, Davida, would you mind just fielding that one? Just mostly because you've been in your position the longest. And so I think because of that, you might have a little longer perspective to be able to bring to bear on that question.
That question is interesting. And I say it's interesting because it's nuanced. I think it incumbent upon the executive team, not only the HR leader in the room, to speak up about the need for a cultural shift in shifting from the policing, the negative connotation that we carry. And I also think it starts with us to help shift some of that cultural philosophy or mentality. I've been using words, and again, we hear things like, oh, that's corporate-y. It's not corporate-y, it's human. Things like employee experience, the employee journey, using words like journey, experience, that naturally, I think, shifts perspective. And I think it's a matter of also opening the door to have continuous feedback, one-on-ones. Again, I probably sound like a big promotion for Culture Amp, but it's the most beautiful tool, even in the one-on-ones. The one-on-ones, there's a section for a well-being check-in. That shifts the narrative of, oh, I'm gonna have my one-on-one just to give you my task list, right? Because I'm going in thinking, oh my gosh, maybe I'm delayed, it's gonna feel punitive. So I think using different language to inspire, to influence, to encourage, makes a world of difference. And so if you have your internal communications, your marketing folks, start infusing some of those things in the language and messaging that's communicated across the organization, and that's how it starts.
Thank you so much. Well, Julia, Talents, Davida, you brought so much and offered so much today. I want to thank you, and please join me in giving our panel a thank you.
And Marguerite, thank you for having us.
Yes, thank
we
you.
are so
You've been a
pleased
great
to have you
moderator.
here. Thank you. Welcome back. Well, I hope you really enjoyed your conversations, and now it's a chance to share with each other all the different conversations we've had and bring us back together. So if you could find your seats, we're going to go ahead and continue with this session. I was just talking to Tim, right, over the break as we were finishing up, and we were saying that at least for us, there's just feels like this tremendous energy to reconnect again. And it feels a little different, I guess, from after the pandemic, the sense of wanting to and needing to pull together and feeling a sense of deeper purpose and collaboration. One image that we use here at the Computer History Museum, since we are a museum that knows about technology, is there's power in personal computing, but we know the real power comes when there's a network. And in a sense, that's kind of the hope today, that each of us here has a tremendous sense of energy and purpose, but when we connect together, just have this sense that the Bay Area as a whole can be a catalyst, a place for leadership and innovation in diversity and inclusion, so thank you. It's my pleasure now to kick off this next session by introducing Kate McGregor. So Kate and I work closely for diversity and inclusion as well as education here, and she is our Director of Education here at the museum. She has an amazing career in STEM and STEAM. She's built and led education programs that have been award-winning. Our Design Code Build program that has been on site here for a long time, and during the pandemic while our doors were closed, she led an amazing team that built our first games. So education games, we launched last December, Minecraft edition, education edition for the Great Tech Story. And coming this summer will be a new Roblox game. So Kate's a woman of many talents, and she'll be leading the discussion now for our report outs. Kate.
Great. Hello. I'm really, really excited for all of you to be here today, and I'm excited to be here as well. It's nice to be back in the building and in person with everybody. I feel like we could have talked for another hour in our first panel discussion down here and asked more questions, and I think probably all of our conversations in our breakout rooms were ones that could have continued as well. So what I'm hoping we can do today is share a little bit from each of those separate breakout sessions so we can get a little bit of insight into those conversations we weren't part of. And I think the bigger picture is that I'd love for our conversations to be ongoing. So I'll talk to you a little bit at the end about how I'm hoping to ensure that all of us in the room today and other colleagues and peers of ours across different institutions in the Bay Area can connect with us and continue to share the challenges we're facing, the successes we're having, the questions we have, the resources we have, because I think we have a lot to offer each other. And in my view, we're really part of one big team in the museum community that is looking at these different topics and trying to find ways that we can really improve and build upon what we've already got in each of our institutions. So I'd love to hear a little bit now from some folks who were in the room talking about content. So I don't know if anyone has been pre-selected, ready, prepared to do that. But if you wanted to, the microphone's just behind you, and if you could share some of the topics and conversations you had there, a few minutes or so, and then we'll hear from the other rooms as well.
Okay. Well, thank you, and yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much to the organizers for today. This was my name's Elizabeth, Dr. Elizabeth Ward. I'm the executive director of the Los Altos History Museum, and it's really a wonderful opportunity to have this conversation today, and I definitely hope we find ways to continue it. Small institution, very small institution, and so having the opportunity to hear from some of the larger institutions, the way you're institutionalizing things and some of the things that you're doing is really inspirational, and we can take little tidbits. So thank you so much for that. In our content discussion, we had like a mix of different organizations, different sizes. We sort of started off with a discussion about collections, and as not all of our institutions had like a traditional collection, but several of them did, and one of the things we came up with was the extent to which our collection and collection policies will limit the kinds of stories you can tell, and some of the strategies that different institutions have been using, from deaccessioning to reaching out to other communities to make sure that our collections give us the resources we need to tell us the kind of stories we want to tell. So there were some really interesting examples of trying to kind of get out from founder syndrome and like taking down the statue at the front of the Asian Art Museum and things like that that are really trying to say, like, you know, whatever colonial practices might have gone into the beginning of our collections, we want to see what we can do to destabilize that and try to diversify on our collection practices. So that was an interesting conversation that I don't know if it would have come up in your other sessions or not, and in the metrics, I don't know if collections were part of your metrics discussion or not, but that was something we talked about on the content side. And then we also got into, as you start thinking about exhibits and how quickly we turn around our exhibit topics, and the fact that, you know, that pressure maybe from the audience building side or from the publicity and marketing side to do a lot of exhibits, and I know I've certainly been guilty of that at my museum, to try to do a lot of exhibits that would target different audiences. So we had a discussion about just that general approach of sort of tokenism, and how do we make sure that our content is actually collaborative from the very beginning, and is not just sort of like a marketing strategy to different audiences. So that was really interesting to hear it from, because we had a range of staff in different positions. And the staff was talking about also for them to be turning out these exhibits super quickly doesn't allow for those real genuine partnerships to develop with our community. So that was another thing that we felt like, to have diverse content, to have content that really tries to get at our values of making sure we're telling a narrative that's inclusive for Santa Clara County. We identified those as 2 roadblocks. You have to have the collection that allows you to do that, and you have to have the time to spend maybe 2 years on really developing the relationship with a diverse community. But we did a couple of so those were sort of problems, but a couple of helpful strategies we talked about was just maybe having exhibit topics that were more like cut across many different cultural groups. So we talked about, like, if you have an exhibit on gender, for instance, like you could bring different voices to that conversation. And so we talked about a couple different models of that. We're trying a place-based model at my museum and our new permit exhibition as another way to kind of get at cutting across, just like continuing to reify the differences of our different communities. So that was one strategy we talked about, but we also identified problems with that in terms of, like, do donors go for it? And we touched on decision making, but we felt like our panel discussion this morning was really, really great on decision making. So we didn't spend as long on that, but I think we all felt like the discussion this morning on making sure it's in your strategic plan and making sure it's sort of institutionalized was another helpful way to make sure you actually have diverse content. So Heidi took amazing notes. So there's way more than this, what we talked about, but I think that was sort of both opportunities and roadblocks that we have for creating diverse content.
Great, thank you so much for sharing. Sounds like it was a really interesting conversation. We can take a couple minutes now. Does anyone who wasn't part of that conversation have any additional comments to add or any questions relating to the content area? We can also come back to it at the end. Okay, so I think if we can hear from the group who was talking about audience, I would love to hear thoughts and insights about that.
Okay, well, so the way I structured it.
Microphone.
I'm not going to speak too long. So the way I structured it is we have a couple different people going to share. So first, Danielle from the Asian Art Museum is going to kind of summarize
We made this very difficult for you. Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle from the Asian Art Museum. And very briefly, an overview of our conversation involved authentic relationship building and talking about the work involved in listening to your audiences and getting their feedback in a meaningful way. So we talked about task forces, focus groups, and all of the individual relationship building that is really necessary to help engage your audiences and communities. And I really loved Reina's point about the multitudes of communities within a community. I think that's a super powerful thing for everyone in museums to think about. And we also touched on what it sounds like the content group also discussed about making sure that the voices in your programs and events are really thoughtful, knowing that you're bringing in something that is of value to your audience, and it's not just something that is what you have on hand. So being proactive to make sure you have the right people bringing the right perspectives that will really honor and uplift whatever topic you're trying to get at. And it's not just a shallow representation of something that you're going to move on from with the next exhibition. So I'm going to pass it along.
Hey everyone, I'm Raina Hamilton over at Lawrence Hall of Science, Manager of Community Engagement and Outreach, and thank you for listening to our story. So when we reopened in October, our featured exhibit was all around COVID, so about the resiliency and creativity of our communities. We had the amazing opportunity to engage an after-school program that is not close to the Lawrence Hall of Science out in Contra Costa County in Antioch. And it was a total accident. So I want folks to take hold of those accidents and those opportunities to push it forward. So there's an after-school program, and I know their coordinators. I have 20 plus years informal ed experience. And they're like, hey, Raina, our kids want to interview you. Okay, cool. So it was a media team. It was totally on Zoom. And okay, so these kids, I'm ready. And I'm thinking they're going to ask me, what is my favorite, science experiment? What's your favorite color? And these kiddos from Antioch asked me about diversity in the workplace. They asked me about my 6-month plan for my new role as community engagement and outreach coordinator. And I said, oh, these kids are on to something. These black and brown kids from Antioch, California are on it. So we knew we had an exhibit. And we wanted to engage these youth to not only make stuff for us, but to amplify their voices, not only of them, but also their parents, their church members, their cousins, their communities. So this news team created some media that was part of our exhibit, featured exhibit. We also put them in touch with researchers at UC Berkeley to have their questions, their community's questions, answered around COVID-19. They created media for their communities. We also put them in research. Oh, the high school group. They were interested in mental health. So, all right, came in there super open-ended. We didn't have an agenda. We're like, what do y'all want to know about? What do you want to do? It was mental health. All right, we can hook you up. They worked with their friends, their families, and interviewed a researcher and created videos for their communities. So now it's evolved. These kids are part of the Lawrence Hall of Science. They have their little shirts and they go to school. They're in middle school. Okay, they're in middle school. And they have their shirts on and they're excited. And we've been able to do multiple partnerships. Now we are going to have them as a focus group to help inform our new exhibit. It's just so exciting. So folks, take opportunities of those accidents in order to grow relationships.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Sure, let's go with your plan here. Yeah.
The only thing I was going to say, and to a certain degree, as part of our conversation, as was just felt by the whole room, this story was so inspiring, but it also made me think in a lot of ways just about the power of the individual. And just one of the things is, so I was just sharing simply that also at one point at a place where I was a long time ago, in a small Jewish museum in Berkeley, California, we were having issues and other things and organizational issues and audience issues and otherwise. And we had a really important upcoming exhibition that was about 2 women photographers who had lived and worked closely together in the middle of the 20th century. And so then with that, we worked to reach out to the LGBT community, and in a way that was authentic and real. We had the content. We also had leaders in the community who were part of organizing the show and stuff, and then really reached out to them. And then for me, in a lot of ways, it was about these individual relationships, as you were talking about church leaders and otherwise, and identifying those people that you really want to talk to. So the thing was that so then when we actually opened the exhibition, it was utterly transformative for the institution, and we had a whole crew of people who came out for the opening and other things and stuff and all of that. And then it meant that the energy for our next opening was also really strong. And the thing that was just really, really beautiful was one of those people who was actively part of organizing the whole thing came for the next show, which was just all about Jewish material culture. And so when I turned to her and I was like, Pamela, it's just so great to see you here. Thanks for coming on back. She was like, my wife is Jewish. Why wouldn't I be here? And so it was just nice. And in terms of talking about the power of individuals in moving some of these broader efforts forward.
All right, now I have 2 mics. Okay.
Thank you so much
back
for
over to
sharing.
you.
Anything else, Kirsten? Oh, okay. Yeah, I think it's really interesting because for all of our different conversations, I think there ended up being so much overlap between content, between audience. I know in our metrics conversation also, we ended up talking a lot about audience and a little bit about content as well. We could have talked a lot longer. We kind of ran out of time there. So it's great to hear those example stories as well. And I think one of the things that I think about when I think about metrics and collecting data is how do we collect that impact data? Like what you're saying that, these students came and did this, and how do we get into the business of storytelling about the work we're doing in a way that is also something that funders might be interested to hear, that the public can then learn to trust us in a different way and get to know us in a different way about the work we're doing, and still be really transparent and clear and honest about where we are trying to get to, and that this is only part of our journey. So I do want to share a little bit about the metrics now. So I think, Courtney, are you able to help with that?
I'll just kind of stand in the back. So Courtney Jones, Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco. When we were talking about metrics, we were looking at it from a couple of different ways. We talked about some of the internal metrics that we are collecting, just kind of the standardized race, age, even for some of our museums, we're talking about sexual orientation. We are also even talking about external matrix. So those matrix internally are not only staff, but our board matrix. When we talk about external, we're thinking about our visitors, our members, and our donors. Some of adding to those things I just mentioned, but also social economic status and trying to collect location. In regards to being internally in the museum, we talked about artists on displays and their race and sex, really looking at both what is currently on display as well as in our archives to help make decisions on how to diversify that more. We really got into a conversation around how do we engage with the community, right? And so how do we figure out a way to get our community to come in and even know who is coming into our museums in different ways for engagement. We talked about building trust and that being really important with the community, especially art institutions when you're trying to go out and reach communities that have continuously been underserved and or marginalized from these spaces and places and what that looks like. We talked about learning lessons and really understanding of how we can learn from these people and not going out there with our own agenda when we're trying to look for information, really being able to just sit and learn. We talked about how there are times in which we don't meet the matrix and then what happens there. I'm all about open, transparent communication. I think it's absolutely fine that if we don't meet the matrix, to acknowledge that openly and honestly, to say that these are the matrices that we miss, and to really have open discussions around how we can do better and what we need to do differently. And so if you had a matrix in which you want to increase the number of BIPOC individuals in your institution and you did not meet that matrix or you did not meet that percentage. So what do you need to do differently? And being open and honest and transparent and being able to talk about that. We talked about ways to work with community-based organizations and being able to use them to help assist us with diversifying and making sure that we're meeting the matrix that we are talking about. There was a lot of conversation around how do we go about doing that? How do we actually make these things happen? And really understanding that just as an institution, as an art institution as a whole, we need to be open and we need to be honest and we need to be able to put it all out there. Building trust takes time. And so as we talk about wanting to increase our matrix, I know that there was a conversation that came out of how do you collect the sexual orientation of your staff. So you actually have to build a relationship with your staff. If your staff does not trust you, they are not going to give you that information. Things like employee resource groups. If you decide that that is something, which I think most organizations, especially in the art institution world, selfless plug, should do, that will help to drive. If people are interested in participating and bringing their full selves, then they'll maybe mention to you that, oh yeah, I am queer, or I am whatever, two-spirited, and then that can help to drive that information. But it also is to not use that information in a performative way. Don't collect it to put it on your website to say that we are now working on diversity. And so being open and honest about what you're going to do, your intention, and why you're collecting it, and building that relationship before you just start running out trying to put demographics on your website is extremely important. So those are kind of the high-level conversations that we were having in the matrix session.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing out about that. We had a lot of Courtney definitely provided a lot of great perspectives from her experience as well during that session, so that was really helpful, and Davida as well. Davida, one of the things you mentioned was about being expected and respected. Do you mind sharing just briefly what you mean by that? Because I think that's something that across the room could be something, I love that phrasing, and I think that across the room that could be something that we think about a little bit differently as we continue on the work. Russell has a microphone for you.
Thank you for putting me on the spot.
Sorry.
So we were just talking about what are we doing with the information that we collect? And, you know, from a people perspective, the data that we collect, which includes, you know, a cross intersection of information to include our families. That information was very useful during the time of COVID shutdown. So we know that for those who self-identified, we have about 40% of our staff who have families. How do we care for them, knowing that, you know, they have to teach their kids at home? And so again, how do we let parents know that SFMOMA is a good place to work and we care for you? That's expected, right? For our populations, our LGBTQ community, what do we do for folks who need enhanced fertility benefits, right? So how do we take this information back to our brokers to dig in deeper on how we as SFMOMA can make them feel expected and also respected? So I think there's numerous ways to use this information and not just sit in the drawer. And we're learning, and so that's sort of behind my whole expected and respected statement is, you know, how do we make people who are from these underappreciated communities feel as though they belong?
Thank you so much. I appreciate you sharing that out. So, sounds like we've had a lot of great conversation. Hearing a little bit more from some of the other groups that we're chatting, are there any questions that you have in your heads now, or anything else that you wanted to share that maybe you didn't get a chance to talk about in the group? Any questions related to the topics that we're exploring? Yeah.
I just want to share an observation I made during the first panel discussion, which is it seems like every institution is reassessing their strategic plan right now. And I am not in a leadership position at my institution, and I think it would be really wonderful to have an intra-institutional conversation, not just at the ED level or leadership level, but general staff, to talk with staff at other institutions about what they're planning or what they want to do differently. And I don't know if there's a platform for that, but I would love to be a part of creating that conversation.
Amazing. I'm glad that you're excited because I'm also excited about it. And that's part of what we wanted to talk about today too, is that this event today has been great to kind of kick-start this conversation, this discussion amongst all of our institutions, and really I don't want it to end there, and I get the sense, I hope that none of us want it to end there, that we want to keep connected. And so I've been trying to figure out over the past while how we can do that, how we can continue that conversation. Davida suggested a great idea of using Microsoft Teams to start a chat group. Some of us may use that within our institutions, some of us may not, but it sounds like it will be possible to have people, even if that's not what the platform your organization is using, that we could start some kind of ongoing chat conversation. We're definitely also going to be writing a report about everything that we explored and discussed here today. We have been recording the panel discussion as well as this session as well. And so we'll share that out. Really intended to be maybe not a starting point, but an important point in all of our journey to connect with each other. I think there's so much, like you're saying, that we can learn from each other at different levels of the institutions we're in and across different institutions. So that's definitely part of the goal. The exact details and logistics of how that will happen, I will be working on in the next few weeks. But I do promise that we will help to connect everyone. If you haven't yet shared your email address of preference for communication about this, I think some of you may have signed up through Eventbrite with personal email addresses. We do want to make sure that we have everyone's accurate and preferred email contact so that we can reach out to you and follow up for this event. So I think Russell is going to help with that. Do you want to just mention quickly where that is?
Yeah, I just, there's one of the little tables out here has a couple of sheets of paper on it for you to add your name, email, and organization on it.
Great. And so if you can all make sure to do that before you leave today, we will distribute that information later to all of us. So assuming you're comfortable sharing that information, please do share it on our sheet here. And you know, we've been hopefully clear about the fact that we are early in our own journey as well. We do not see ourselves as experts in this. We definitely see ourselves as eager to learn and ambitious in trying to create change. However, one of the things that we do feel like we can try to do, hopefully, is bring together people to have these conversations and lead discussion about these topics. So we will do our best to continue facilitating conversation around this and communication. And I've been so excited and inspired by all the different stories shared and so many different people from different museums here. And I know that there were a few folks from different institutions that weren't able to join us today, so I will also include those folks in conversation. But yes, to your question and your point, yes, I think this is a starting point, and we definitely have a lot to learn from each other. So hopefully you're all on board with that. We got you in here, and now we want you to stay. Any other questions or thoughts from today's conversations that we maybe haven't covered yet? Reflection as we're kind of getting towards the end of our structured session here today? Kirsten has her hand up and needs a microphone in the back.
Something I found interesting was just a discussion about kind of as organizations, we're at different points in our history. I consider the Computer History Museum just coming out of founder's phase. We're a relatively young museum. We talked a little bit about the skeletons in our closets at certain organizations and also the stories we tell. You know, we have a lot of, the history of computing has been primarily kind of a white man story, and just how younger audiences are interacting with our content. And I think just this idea of not shying away from the skeletons in our closet and seeing them more as an opportunity to talk about difficult topics and rethink how we tell our stories. I thought that was an interesting theme that came up. I don't know if that happened in other groups, but.
Yeah, I think we definitely in our retro conversation talked about how we frame things. So I think both in the context of what you're talking about in terms of the stories we're telling, what specifically about content, how can we frame and reframe some of the content that we've shared over the years, and as we create more content, how do we frame things to our audiences, both our existing audiences and our audiences who don't yet know us or maybe don't feel comfortable engaging with us? How do we frame the surveys we want to share with them, the questions we want to ask them? How do we frame how we collect data, how we collect data about our own staff teams, and how do we create that sense of trust, and framing is just so important. So I think, you know, definitely here, having been here for a few years as well, the stories we try to collect and that we choose to collect, not just the objects and artifacts. And also, I thought the conversation that we had a little bit too about really understanding your collection, both what's on display and what is in your archives, to better understand what's missing, then allows us to figure out what our priorities are, and also to get other people on board, whether that is our leadership team or external donors or the public, the audience, I think is really, really important as well.